Live in a minute, and we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm Manjima Sarkar, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS Review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is social issues addressed through street art. We are honored to have with us Dr. Cameron McAuliffe, Dr. Jeffrey Ian Ross, and Leena Kejriwal ma'am as our esteemed speakers for today's panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Leena Kejriwal is a photographer and social artist based in Mumbai and Kolkata. A brand ambassador for Fuji India, in 2014 she founded the Missing Project, a campaign against sex trafficking and slavery with the single purpose of creating mass awareness. It won the Thomson Reuters Anti-Trafficking Campaign of the Year award in 2021. She has been honored with World Summit Award 2020, Her Story Woman on a Mission Award 2019, the M Billionth Award for the Missing Game in the year 2018, etc. She has made relevant public presentations at game conferences and has been a 6-time TEDx speaker. In 2016, she launched the Missing Game for the Cause, which won the NASCOM Indie Game of the Year and ranked number 1 on Google Play Store in the popular free games category. Now let me introduce our second speaker. Jeffrey Ian Ross, PhD, is a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Baltimore. He has researched, written, and lectured on corrections, policing, political crime, state crime, crimes of the powerful, violence, street culture, and crime and justice in American Indian communities. Professor Ross is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of several books, including the Routledge Handbook of Graffiti and Street Art, 2016, and the Routledge Handbook of Street Culture, 2021. Now, let me take the opportunity to introduce our third and final speaker for today's panel. Dr. Cameron McAuliffe is a senior lecturer in human geography and urban studies at Western Sydney University, Australia. He draws on interdisciplinary approaches to better understand and account for wicked problems in the 21st century city. Dr. Cameron is an internationally recognized expert in the governance of graffiti and street art. His research partnerships have helped urban managers better understand the perils, pitfalls, and possibilities of contemporary graffiti management. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. Leena, ma'am, I request you to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for this platform. Thank you so much for having us here, Manjima, and tell me your story. And I'm really happy to actually get and connect with two distinguished gentlemen here on this panel. And I'm going to have, I think, having more interesting conversations with them from here on, because I think what they're saying is very relevant to my work and be great to know their have more insights on their and their thoughts on what I do, because I've come into this space just like an artist and very organically, and with the single-minded focus of prevention of sex trafficking. And I didn't even realize that I'd be setting out to do guerrilla art when I started it. It was just my way to figure out any which means to catch the public eye. So I'm just going to take you through a very short presentation to give a little understanding about the Missing Project, which I launched in 2014 after about a decade of being in red light districts, working with NGOs and friends who were working on anti-trafficking, and realizing that Their pet peeve was that the public, which is the biggest stakeholder in the issue of sex trafficking, is far away from all conversations. Sex trafficking seems to be more like a civic issue, a legal issue, but it's actually a social issue. And everybody says that nobody has the time, right? Everybody who's in the anti-trafficking space are so caught up with the legal, the civic, the rehab, the repatriation, that the prevention and the public dialogue is just not something which people are really working on. So I'm just going to share my screen. I hope this works well. Sorry if there are any goof ups. Um, so I'm going to just share my screen. Yep, you can see my screen. I'm assuming now. Uh, so you can see my slideshow,
Yes,
right?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I'll do a full screen so that let's see. So these are some stats which come on to us when we are talking about sex trafficking, and it's an enormous social problem, and there are numbers which are staggering. And so let me just paint you a picture. So you see a stat on a paper, and then you see something like this. These are the missing girls. They're silhouettes. They are black silhouettes set against the sky like black holes into which millions of girls disappear from the face of the earth. And it has to be a black hole because only a black hole can contain the huge, humongous numbers of girls going missing. And these are larger than life memorials of every girl who's lost or every girl who's still there and who's not found. So these are two visual imageries. One you see a stat on a paper, and one you see this. So which one moves you more? I think hands down it's going to be public art murals or public art for me. And I think I can vouch for most. So, public art forms like murals, installations, sculptures, and these are not just mediums of, I say, beautifying a city. I think public art plays a huge potential of starting public dialogues and curiosity, empathy, and mindfulness amongst a whole population. And they can be very powerful dialogue starters, which has actually been a great way for us. That's what happened with Missing. So I started with setting out to do this. I launched it at the India Art Fair, and I got this amazing coverage on UK Guardian, which says India's missing cast shadow over the National Art Fair. So that's the kind of there was this public art which was not saying anything. It was a silent, this just black shadow for girl. And that's the kind of headlines I received from the UK Guardian the day after the show. So, I mean, I see great potential there. And then you have the silhouette from the public art which I'd created turned out that I wasn't able to traverse this public private partnerships and public permissions. I was this artist working out from a studio in Kolkata. Most of the permissions and public spaces have to be have to be maneuvered in the national space through Delhi. So it was a struggle. So I kind of sat back and I said, if I really want to talk to the public, what's stopping me doing it now? And I started a crowdfunding and I started doing, I did the whole guerrilla art campaign with the missing girl silhouette. So that's like one of the silhouettes which you see in Kolkata. We have about 5,000 such. And um, the government knows I'm doing it because they know I'm the owner of this guerrilla art. So it's it's guerrilla because sometimes you see an empty wall and the next day you see a silhouette there. And that's the guerrilla. But I think they all know that it's me doing it. And yet at the same time, another very powerful thing which happened was for me to give everybody the dialogue, I put this down on my website and I said, here, take it down and do it. I gave ownership of the silhouette to anybody and everybody who wanted to be a part of this engagement with me. And so we have about 5,000 silhouettes across the city and in the country and in the world. I've had um, people across the world who've taken it. So what's really amazing for me, what does public art place really makes it really good for me? It makes it accessible for me to reach the public. Because even if I do the missing campaign, I did it in the galleries in the initial days when I was making these complicated installations. But if I really want to create a public dialogue, it has to be in the public space. And so I kind of took to the walls of the city, and it gives me an amazing access to the public, and that's the kind of interactions I see. And another thing which has given me a good opportunity is that the artwork itself doesn't get lost in translation. In India, we have a new language every 100 or every 500 kilometers. And this artwork has actually traversed all language barriers. And later on, I'll show you a slide about, we did a kind of an impact study of the silhouette in Sundarbans, which is in Bengal, village in Bengal, and the kind of retention and efficacy the silhouette has had there. Another really important way I've used this public art spaces is through murals. So always since the day one, when I was saying I want to create engagements, I said for me the use of the smartphone is becoming crucial today to become a public space. So though I got opportunities to create murals like this, I actually put a chatbot over it. And you can actually engage with this silhouette through FB Messenger, chat with the girl, and you say, who is this? This is Pari. What does Pari do? Why is she angry? And slowly the chat takes you into her narrative, and we've seen audiences kind of come in very peppily and slowly get more deeper in the conversation of sex abuse, exploitation, and leaving behind with a better understanding of the role they could be playing in the rising figures of exploitation. So that's the kind of stats we've seen of the efficacy of the silhouette in Sundarbans. 78% said that of the sample said they knew about the silhouette. They didn't ignore it. 44% found the child line number which I had embedded in the silhouette artwork useful. 26% found the silhouette thought provoking. 78% again said they definitely felt sad, which is the first emotion a public art can do, is evoke emotion, and it's done that. And 5% of course said very uncomfortable, we don't like to see it. So it has provoked all kinds of emotions, which for me is a big impact agenda. And this whole silhouettes, like you can see today, it's part of school programs, it's part of any artists anywhere in the world who wants to take it down in any shape, sizes. We've had somebody draw it in their in actually drawing competitions. We've seen some people draw little 4-inch figures of 4 feet figures, any dimensions and any shapes and any sizes. We do have a little YouTube video here to show what kind of a campaign this has become. I could just take you through it. Recording. Okay, it's recording. Let's start. Thank you so much. That was me, and yes, I think I'm done with my.
Thank you. All right. No worries, ma'am. That's okay. It was illuminating, and we are so glad that you empowered so many people out there, like millions and millions of people, to take this up, and even they can try out. They can install this on their walls, and this is the true form of uh, making people aware of the cause that you wanted to put across, and your voice has been heard by millions of people out there. We strongly believe that. On that very note, I would request Dr. Ross to please present his views. Over to you, sir.
Great. So I'm going to start with a bit of a story. It's an autobiographical story. So I have a large number of general interests and a smaller set of research, scholarly research specialties. If I was to, I guess, tell you what my larger interests are, I have an interest in things like codes, control, crime, deviance, gentrification, harms, illegalities, identity harm, state responses, all the way to, vandalism. But if I was to forced to narrow down my scholarly interests, I'd probably say that I have 5 subfields, and those have dominated my academic writing, as you mentioned before. Those include subjects such as corrections, policing, crimes of the powerful, graffiti and street art, and street culture. Keep in mind also that not everything in these categories is of interest to me, and thus by default, some are more interesting to me than others. And these interests have also changed over time. For example, at one point in time in my career, I did a lot of policing research, and now I do a lot more street culture work. There are a number of reasons why my interests and focus of research have changed. But I'm here to talk about graffiti and street art. So where does that, where do I start with that aspect? So since I was, beginning as a kid and continuing during my high school years, I spent a considerable amount of time creating visual art, graphic design, painting, photography, and sculpture. I was both frustrated and disappointed with the quality of instruction in my public high schools. So in my last year in high school, before I dropped out, I enrolled in courses at the Ontario College of Art. Now it's called Ontario College of Art and Design. And after I dropped out, I took a few classes also from that academic institution. Later, I was accepted to the Central Technical School Commercial Art Program, as well as the Photographic Arts Program at Ryerson College, now University, but I chose not to attend. At that point in time, I was very impatient, unruly, undisciplined, and I craved excitement and escape from the sanitized and stifling experiences of the suburbs where I grew up. And also from what I consider to be a really mediocre public school education system. I was attracted to the streets, the back alleys, the persons who inhabited them. So I worked for 2 years as a courier, got my taxi driver's license, and for an additional 2 years, I drove nights in Toronto. The people who lived and worked during that time, during those nocturnal hours, from police officers to the nurse, to the waitress, to the bartender, these individuals fascinated me. I picked up in my cab people going to bars, people going to parties, people coming home from them, small-time hustlers, sex workers, johns, drug dealers, victims of crime. These were my customers. I was their conduit, if only temporarily. This was my life, and I really did enjoy it. But for a number of reasons, I decided that I wanted to go back to school. And so I enrolled. I got into the backdoor program at University of Toronto. I grew up in Toronto. I concentrated in psychology and political science. I worked in a correctional facility for close to 4 years, but wasn't content with my job prospects. And so I decided to do a master's and a PhD. My master's focused on terrorism. My PhD focused on police violence, both in Toronto and New York City. So I followed an academic path. And after 2 years of teaching and conducting research in the fields that I previously mentioned, I finally taught an undergraduate class in graffiti and street art at University of Baltimore. And unexpectedly, that became my favorite course. Naturally, I started doing research and writing and publishing, scholarship on graffiti and street art, and in many respects have come to realize that my scholarship on graffiti and street art is a way of coming full circle. So graffiti and street art integrates both my general interests and also a lot of my scholarly interests. But over time doing this research, I noticed that a lot of the work on graffiti and street art was really short on what I would call empirical scholarly analysis. It was of uneven quality. It was distributed through a diverse number of scholarly venues. And what was really missing was a reference book that presented and analyzed, research theories, ideas related to graffiti and street art. And so I was determined to, as I've done in previous iterations, assemble a book of people who are experts in the field on graffiti and street art. So a couple of years back, I edited a book called The Rutledge Handbook of Graffiti and Street Art. I've continued to conduct research and write on graffiti and street art. This includes peer-reviewed articles, chapters in scholarly books, and blog posts. That pretty much summarizes kind of where I've been and where I'm at today.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for sharing a slice of your life and sharing your experiences. I do think we have learned a lot from what you wanted to share about graffiti and street art and your journey with them and through them. Now, I'd request Dr. McAuliffe to please share your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Manjima. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. We're all at different times of the day and night, so it's all interesting bringing us all together in this venue. Where I am back in Sydney, I'm on Indigenous lands of the Gadigal people where I live, and it's important for us to always recognise these lands, and they always were and they always will be Aboriginal lands. So I just thought I'd start that by acknowledging that. So I'm a geographer, and my esteemed panelists are steeped in the arts, and I myself have not come out of a practice background. I came to graffiti and street art really through an investigation of what it is that makes it an interesting urban problem. So as an urban geographer, I'm interested in the fact that that graffiti and street art has been an interesting place over the last 20 years as we've seen the emergence of what we call street art as an artistic practice, as recognised as a way of understanding art in place. And I just thought I'd start with this, which is typically seen as a tag that you would typically think of as crime. But if we look closer, this is actually a tag that's been put up in an artistic way. Barry McGee, also known as Twist, West Coast artist from the US. This is in New York and in Lower Manhattan, Houston and Bowery Street. This artistic piece was then became very symbolised in a big retrospective exhibition that happened in LA called Art in the Streets, and it really, I think, symbolises what I think of as a wicked problem in the city. You know, what is graffiti and what is street art? And earlier on we were hearing about the idea of guerrilla art in the city and what that means, and that's a question around legality, a question around permission, a question around intent that creates a whole lot of interesting questions. And of course, here's Barry McGee, who was invited to come to Sydney to paint in a program of public art in laneways, designed to revitalise laneways through street art. And he got hold of a scissor lift and then did this on the side of the Thai Airways building in downtown Sydney, and caused a great stir, because he reproduced that art again, but this time without permission, and had the city of Sydney running around in a tiz because they didn't know what to do, because he was an invited guest doing the permission work just around the corner from this building. So for me, this is the type of thing that I look at. So if I go back to where I began this, which was back in 2009, so this is a map of Sydney. Sydney is broken up into these local government areas, and I started out in Western Sydney near my university in a place called Parramatta, where they had some legal graffiti walls, and it fascinated me that they were called legal graffiti walls, because at that stage I didn't know that we had this thing called legal graffiti. In fact, I thought it was a contradiction in terms. And so I went and investigated what was happening at these legal walls at a time when the local government was looking at these walls and saying that they were causing a problem. These were what we would call harm minimisation sites, where young people would go to, do their art, and they could do it legally there. These sites were made available because the idea is that this would limit their impact on the urban environment to these locations. But then they became politicised and then turned into illegal spaces. And then contestation ensued with the artists themselves until the point when the local government knocked down the walls. And so what we had was this conundrum around the tension between art and crime and graffiti practice in these particular locations, that once it became a political hot potato, ultimately led to the discontinuation of those programs as the contradiction at the centre of graffiti and street art was laid out. So here's an example of one of those walls where people would go down, and they would go there, on a Saturday morning. And what I found interesting was that when I was at those walls, I thought that I would find young people who didn't have any esteem or fame in the graffiti street culture. What I found actually was that the older kings and queens of graffiti were coming down there because graffiti was becoming criminalised. They couldn't afford to be caught doing graffiti at night because they had jobs, family, responsibilities now as adults. But more importantly, they were time poor, just like other adults are. They couldn't afford to scope out the rail yards for 3 nights during the week and then, get there at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so they would scratch their itch by coming down to these legal walls. So there's my grandfather clock in the background there. And here's a message left by one of the graffiti queens, Spice, who was actually working on the wall when she got moved on by the police because the legal space had become an illegal space. So I started working on these issues with local governments. I also started connecting up with graffiti writers and street artists, and I connected up particularly with a group of graffiti writers who became street artists, who put themselves on the pathway to contemporary art. They were working in pop-up galleries. Here's an example. This is above a pub in Sydney where they brokered a deal so that they could have an arts venue. And they were in the business of changing their practice. But that didn't mean that they were all immediately turning their back on their illegal activity. It meant that they were taking advantage of emerging opportunities under what we call the creative economy. And so here we had young people who were using their experience as advertisers, as social media natives, as artists, in order to do these events. At the same time, the City of Sydney and other local governments were interested in capturing the value of street art in the public sphere. This group that I'm showing here doing this artwork, they were invited to become, to go down to the Museum of Contemporary Art in a big festival called Creative Sydney. So they did that, but instead of doing the art on the night, they did that big artwork, and then they took it down, had a big event, and then did this piece of performance art at the end, where they came out and they went through this process of what we might call a creative destruction. And they ended the event by stenciling on there, clean by Sydney Council. Just to point out the real contradictions in inviting these people who were actually producing the creative economy through their street art, through the events they were doing, down to this high art venue down by the harbour in order to take advantage of them while still removing their work and criminalising them in the public sphere. So an interesting conundrum. At the same time, I started doing work with places like Blacktown out in the west of Sydney, in the lower socioeconomic areas in Sydney. And here we see Spice working with another artist here at a youth recreation centre where she did legal art programs with young people as a diversionary program. But here we have senior high-profile graffiti writers who are actually working with local government, working with youth agencies in order to get kids interested in doing legal work as opposed to illegal work, and also connecting up with some of the technical colleges and the like, and looking at them moving into pathways towards things like sign writing, for example. But also, one of the questions that I had was whether young people weren't just getting into graffiti because they wanted to become a notorious graffiti writer or a gang member or a criminal per se, but whether they were getting into this practice because they could see vocational pathways towards becoming a graphic designer or something like that in the creative economy. So we have an overlap there that's happening in youth work, but also in the interests of the local government. And so here, this is a quote from the guy who I was doing research for with Blacktown when we talked to his boss, who was in charge of cleaning all the graffiti in Blacktown. He just said, just don't talk to me about legal walls. So then we go towards the city of Sydney, which is downtown in Sydney, and we work with the local government there in order to deal with one of the big contradictions they had, because they were trying to move towards becoming a so-called creative city and capture the creative economy, and they were doing it through things like the Art and About program, the Streetwear program, where they were employing artists to do laneway artwork. For example, here we see some artwork by Beastman, Yock, and Numbskull on the left there. And Numbskull I've followed through, and I'll show you some of his more recent work in a second. And so this artwork, for example, was given permission to be there. In fact, it was paid for by the council. It was set up on a one-year permission program under what they call a development application. At the end of that year, the restaurant that was in the that owned the wall actually said, "This is great. We don't mind if it stays here." And so that was rolled over, and to this day, that artwork still remains. And so we see productive collaborations happening in making space for these creative artworks by people who would formerly be doing it without permission, and gaining value because it was without permission for different audiences. Here's another artwork, this time by an Indigenous artist down in Chinatown in Sydney. Big outlay on the costs of this artwork. It's become quite a destination down near Chinatown. And so when you're doing these types of public artworks, they have to have a maintenance program. They have to have a life that's maintained by the council. There's if someone does paint over it, what's going to happen to it? What happens at the end of life? How do we then get rid of that artwork at the end? And so all of these things become a significant question for how a local government might contribute to what is normally quite an informal process of getting art up in the streets. So we did some work with the City of Sydney, and we went round and looked at all the places where there was graffiti and street art, and we actually were responding to a question of theirs, which is how can we tell the significance of street art? And so we did that and went round and said, there's all these significant sites, but don't worry, we don't think that you need to have to control these. Instead, what you could do is use your power to not engage with them. Because in the criminalisation of graffiti and street art in Sydney, local councils have been vested with enormous powers to remove without permission, not just of the artist, but of the building owner, if it can be reached from public space. And so our work with the city helped them to actually start to recognise the locations where they should have places where they can allow for street art to occur with a permission of a building owner, and they don't need formal approval. And if it should so come to pass that it becomes a contested site in the public sphere, then the government would go, okay, fine, well, let's convene some discussions about that and see where we go with it. But essentially taking a more hands-off approach. We can see it's not the whole local government area because there are heritage issues and conservation issues and a whole lot of things that come into play as well. So what does that mean? Well, if we come to the present, just a couple of months ago, the Creative Sydney event was, 10 years on from before, and now it's very sophisticated. And so graffiti and street artists is actually made a way into this space alongside all of the other sophisticated material that's happening there in this light and art show. And this is the work by this man, who was invited in as a specific special artist, and he had a venue where they had digital art that was being presented. But also importantly, he was the brand ambassador for Bombay Sapphire as well. And so we can see his artwork there. And so we've got graffiti writers becoming street artists, becoming contemporary artists, and moving into more formal relationships with local government, with industry, with creative industries, as they professionalise their work. Of course, this is one trajectory, but it's not the only trajectory. But for these young artists, it's been an important pathway that they've taken, and they've taken advantage of the spaces that have opened up for them. And here's an example along a lane along the new metro where Beastman has, Numbskull has been a commissioned artist. But back out in Blacktown, we've been doing some work out there in laneways ourselves, including some old school graffiti as they celebrate their heritage around graffiti and street art through collaborations between the council and the arts centre in Blacktown. And so there's a whole range of different ways that different types of art are still making a space both legal and illegal, and contributing to a very complex pattern of governance and practice in the city. So I'll just leave it there. I'll come back to that later if I need to. Okay, that's what I've been doing.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving us that visual tour. It was amazing, and calling it wonderful would be an understatement. So now I think we can move on to our next segment. We shall now begin our question answer session. And I'd like to start today's session with Leena, ma'am. So, ma'am, you have recently launched the Missing podcast. How was making this podcast different from your public art installations to begin a conversation about social issues like cyber safety or child protection in India? Can you compare these two experiences? And do you think podcasts will help you reach a bigger audience?
I can't say bigger, but it's a big audience, and it's definitely increased up under COVID. And what the podcast gives me the ability to do is have more immersive conversations on each of these different aspects of child sex abuse and exploitation. It's creative. I'm a creative director of my trust, of my foundation. And it's just another form of creativity which I can use to really reach people, ignite curiosity, knowledge, make them understand. Because, like I keep saying everywhere, that child sex abuse exploitation is a social issue. So, so we have to, like, I think as a creative, I can really add a lot of value in the space in raising awareness and engaging the public on the issue, because it's all demand driven. It's about people not really addressing it, becoming passive acceptors of what's happening. So we have to shake everybody out of the stupor. And a lot of children who don't know that they can get exploited and abused, a lot of children who don't know that they're becoming part of the demand making curve. So we tackle the whole issue from all different angles. And the podcast has definitely given me a very, very good opportunity to explore a deeper conversation in each of these facets. So it's different, and it's another great opportunity for me.
That's great that you are being able to explore a different space now. And on that note, I think I have a relevant question for Dr. McAuliffe. So, if you please answer this question, do you think there are misconceptions about street art practices, and what are the misconceptions an urban society may have regarding street art?
everyone's got misconceptions, but I wouldn't think about it as misconceptions. I think about it as we're all audiences to this, but we all come from different perspectives. And if you like, it's not just that we all see things differently, but that we all, if you like, fold around different ways of seeing the city. So I'm just going to quickly share again, because where I ended up, I think, is actually relevant in that slideshow. So I'll just quickly show this, because in my other work, I look at value in the city. And it's coming now, I think. And I'm interested in plural values, and I'm interested in the way that different people carry with them different ways of seeing the city based on the fact that they are influenced by the way that they value the city. And so we can think about what might be important to someone who's looking at a piece of art that we might think of as art, but they might not see any aesthetic value in it whatsoever, and all they see is something that's illegal. Or it might be that there's a public discourse that criminalizes that particular kind of art, or it might be it's in the wrong neighborhood or on the wrong building. And so when we think about whether there's misconceptions, I think the best way to think of it is, art's in the eye of the beholder, and art in the street is the same. And so we have a complex set of interactions going on in the street around whether it's legal, and that might be something that's important to someone that's enforcing the law, or it might be important to someone who owns a building, or it might be seen as something that adds economic value, and that might be a way that, say, an arts manager might be looking at the way that taps into a creative economy, or that tourism might be a way of thinking about the way that art contributes to our public sphere. Or it might be about the artists themselves and the way that they see that what they do, whether it be a tag or a piece of street art, contributes to their communities. And that might mean their subculture, or it might mean the way that they see it makes a nicer city. And so whenever we look at a piece of art, there's lots of different ways of viewing it. Some of those ways become the way that we govern that space. And so it might be that that art gets removed. But even in that contestation, for that period of time that it's up, it tells a different story. It actually tells a different way of seeing the space. It actually works itself into possible other ways of governing that space, of valuing that space, and it speaks to particular communities, but it can also speak to new communities through that public space.
Right, sir. And thank you for your answer. It was amazing. Ma'am, I would like to get back to you. How have your professional pursuits of photography and social art been different, and how have you managed to find a middle ground between them?
Okay, so I started as a photographer, and this is like I was still in the analog days. We used to shoot negatives. You continue into a digital camera. You go out, shoot everything you can feel, because it still excites you of how you can capture. But of course, slow and slowly, the way the digital cameras really transformed, and it was becoming the skill which a photographer needed to have was really not needed after a certain point of time. So if I was able to give you fantastic exposed images at some point of time, it was slowly becoming something which everybody was doing anyway. And also, I think it's years of doing the same thing. Like I was doing a lot of street photography, people photography, portraits of people in their environments, and a lot of human stories. And so at some point, I think we also evolve as a artist, and you say, so what next? Do I just want to go out and shoot another city, another lane, another road? I mean, what am I saying in that? So, and at the same time, I was already getting really drawn to the issue of sex trafficking, and I really wanted to. That became like my core subject, which I was pursuing. So slowly, I kind of drew in that way, and I got drawn into installations. So though today I do photograph, but it's more topical. Like at the moment, I'm doing an amazing project on Qawwalis of India, and that really excites me. So I think photography still really, it's my meditation, but I think I like to do it specific to intention of what I'm trying to capture, and it's not just me walking with a camera anywhere and everywhere now. And uh, and I think this new mode of installation and public art, and pursuing my cases and my stories and my girls with my photographs. I mean, missing has elements of everything. Photography is very much there, mural art's there, installations are there, guerrilla art is there, all these creative memes are there. But so it's all come along. It's coming along. I don't think too much. It's just every day is another day.
That's amazing, ma'am. It's like a creative milieu, and as you have beautifully described your professional journey as a photographer and then, of course, as an installation artist. Professor Ross, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. So, can you talk about the key differences between street art and graffiti, since we are talking about this particular topic today in detail? And do you think these both terms can be used interchangeably?
Great question. I think there's a lot of misinterpretation amongst people with respect to graffiti and street art. So that's where I'm going to begin. So another thing to keep in mind is that understanding, if you want to understand what graffiti is and what street art is, you have to see it as part of a larger picture. And the larger picture is basically urban art, which encompasses anything from, well, graffiti and street art, but also includes such things as statues and murals and even architecture for that matter. And then there's something called public art, which is, I would say, a subcategory of urban art. But in general, graffiti typically refers to words or figures and images that are written or they're drawn or they're painted or even etched onto a surface. That surface can be a wall, typically, can be glass, it can be a door. And here, the owner of that property has not given permission to the individual or group of people, for that matter, to do this kind of activity. Again, this is a general definition because we have such things as graffiti style. We'll see this in fashion, shoes, shirts, dresses, fabrics that have a graffiti style. We'll see art that is placed in museums and galleries that have graffiti style, or there'll be an artist or a group of artists who use elements of graffiti or that style in their work. Then there's street art, which typically I consider to be things like stickers or stencils, or what one might call artistic or non-commercial posters. And these are affixed, again, they're affixed to surfaces. It can be a wall, it can be a sidewalk, and again, the person does not have permission. The issue of not having permission brings up the issue of illegality. And again, these stencils, these stickers, these posters, non-commercial posters, they can include words, figures, images, that sort of thing.
Thank you, sir, for simplifying a rather difficult concept for a layman like me. And I think we got a better clarification, and we can obviously clarify our misconceptions around the concepts of street art and graffiti now. So, and now I would like to request Dr. McAuliffe to answer a question. So, in one of your book chapters titled Young People and the Spatial Politics of Graffiti Writing, you have discussed how graffiti has been constructed as outside the normal ordering of social space, as out of place in the city. So, does that mean graffiti is an art form for transgressors? Would you like to put across your views regarding this?
Yes, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because what I'm struck by here is that we're talking from different countries, we're talking from different cities and different experiences, and when we do that, we talk from different understandings of what is accepted in our city, in our neighbourhoods, on our walls, and by so doing, we have if you like, a mental map of our own city. And when things are out of place in our own mental map, we notice them. But our mental maps are different. And so what's normal in our cities and our city spaces changes over time, and it changes between places. And so one of the most interesting things about looking at graffiti style and graffiti art and graffiti writing is that it comes from the Northeast United States in a particular period of time where it started out and then became criminalized and then became part of a subculture that formed out of that criminalization, and it became masculinized and in many ways fetishized, and then has moved around the world as a particular kind of practice. And so we see the types of practice that's associated with graffiti, which is to do something illegally, to use a particular kind of artistic style, to put it up on walls, to put it on the trains, by people who don't know who they are, don't know each other, and they're out there and they're doing this work because it has become, if you like, globalized. And that's very interesting because it finds itself in different places where it might not be a problem. And so there's some interesting work that was done in China about graffiti and street art that was showing that actually, we think of China as quite authoritarian, lots of controls, but they didn't have laws in place to remove graffiti. Graffiti wasn't being associated with criminality in the way that it was coming out of the United States, for example, and even here in Australia, where it became associated with gang culture and crime. In the case of what was happening in China, there was much more of a bleeding into more artistic and aesthetic practice around graffiti and then street art. And then we saw the state actually not worrying about it. And one of the reasons it wasn't worried about was because, for example, in a place like Shanghai, where I went and did some work, there were a whole lot of informal advertisements that you would find on the wall that had been put on there where people were trying to get work by putting up their name and number on the walls so that they could be contacted as a labourer, for example. And so that patina of graffiti, because technically that's graffiti, was actually normalised there. And so when people started doing their own practice there, it wasn't seen so much as out of place. It wasn't seen as a problem. And so one of the problems that we have is the way that we amplify the idea of how bad graffiti is by criminalising it. And so we see that criminalisation happening in particular places where the simple practice of putting art on a wall, again, in the eye of the beholder, can lead to jail terms, can lead to large fines, can lead to a disproportionate response. And so when we look at what's normal in a place, graffiti often acts against that normality to try and send a different message. But in other places, it might actually be in place. And so that can happen at different scales. It can happen across the world. It can happen in the same city. And so around the corner, it might be that there's a piece of graffiti that persists because it's in between places. It's not controlled. It's not seen as a problem. It might not be an issue. But if it's put around the corner on another building, out come the cleaners, and they have to clean it off because someone's screaming and yelling because it's out of place.
Right. So thank you so much. It was enlightening. And finally, before we conclude today's panel, I'd like to ask another question to Dr. Ross. So, in one of your papers, we can explore 17 English language documentary films that have been made on contemporary graffiti and street art. Which aspects of street art do you think these documentary films try to carve out and present before their viewers?
That's a great question. I was hoping that you would not ask me that one. And I'm going to kind of spin that question around for the following kind of reasons. I mean, I think so I have published on graffiti and street art themes in documentaries, or documentaries on graffiti and street art. And I've also published on on fictional movies that have been built around a graffiti or graffiti writer, and then I've also, put them together because why wouldn't I? And I think both documentaries and films that use graffiti and street art are important, and both of them use what I would call, and others, tropes, you know, certain kind of rituals that the public believe that graffiti writers must engage in. Stealing, first of all, typically young males of racialized backgrounds, stealing spray paint and doing their work in alleyways or in rail yards, and eventually they're going to get caught by the police. And there may be a love story, particularly in the fiction type movies, as part of the background. But I think, and we do learn a lot. And we and also graffiti writers and street artists learn a lot from the documentaries and the movies, and the general public is sensitized to this subculture and this type of public art. What I think is perhaps even more powerful is the social media aspects, and we've seen that accelerate. The dissemination of graffiti and street art. First with YouTube, and then secondly with sites such as Facebook, or maybe Facebook was first, and graffiti and YouTube second. Who's to say? And now also with Instagram, and I know Dr. McAuliffe has written about this particular subject and at great length. So, and each of these types of media has the ability to educate, has the ability to shape our views, and to put forward misinterpretations of both this type of public art, or urban art, and also the messages and motivations of people. So I think I'll leave it at that. But if you want to ask a follow-up question, you or anybody else, I'm happy to do my best to answer.
Thank you, sir. I think you have given us an idea of social media being a very powerful medium, and we can anticipate the future of street art practices, and how it can be visualized. On that note, we would like to close today's session. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thanks to Professor Cameron McAuliffe, Professor Jeffrey Iron Ross, and Leena Kejriwal ma'am for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much, speakers, for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Our pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you all. Be in touch.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.